In this section, we will look into markets, which are very important in our contemporary economy. Production is, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, a social process that people engage in groups and in ways that are interdependent among individuals. As a result, the output that is produced must be distributed among members of society. Markets are one possible way of distributing what is produced. Markets also can play a role in determining what is produced. What economists mean by a market is a relationship between buyers and sellers of something, in which the buyers offer money in exchange for a good or service. In everyday language, a market is a place where you go to get something. But to an economist, a market is an abstract relationship between these two groups, buyers and sellers. Economists have constructed a simple model of a competitive market. There are several assumptions made about the features of a competitive market. First, that the product is homogeneous, which means that every piece of the product is the same as every other. So something like wheat. Second, that there are a large number of buyers and sellers. And third, that all of the exchanges take place at the same price. There's a single price in each time period. The third assumption means that there's no real passage of time. Of course, in a real market, prices can go up or down even during a day in some markets. If you want to get airline tickets, they can go up or down in 10 minutes. Now, economists use a graph to represent a market. This is the famous supply and demand graph. The demand curve, the green one, shows for each possible price represented on the vertical axis the quantity of the good that would be demanded by those who want to buy it. The blue line, referred to as the supply curve, shows for each price the quantity that sellers will be offering for sale at that price. For some reason, economists use the word curve to describe a straight line, but you have to live with that. The demand curve slopes downward, meaning that at a lower price there will be more demanded, and the supply curve slopes upward, meaning that at a higher price more will be supplied. The interaction of buyers and sellers in a competitive market will result in a price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, sometimes called the market clearing price or the equilibrium price. In this graph, you see Q asterisk is the equilibrium quantity, and P asterisk is the price at which supply and demand match. At the market price, both buyers and sellers are satisfied, and hence the price will remain where it is, in a state of what is called equilibrium. Now, what can markets do? There are two different functions that markets can perform. First, markets can ration a fixed supply of some product among those who want to get it. That's the rationing function of markets. For example, the number of seats in a restaurant on a particular evening is fixed. The amount of fish in a fresh fish market on a given day is fixed. And the market relations can be used to determine who will get the fixed good. A second function of markets is referred to as allocation of resources. That is, a market system can allocate inputs. Resources is just a word for inputs, among alternative possible uses. And the markets determine what is produced and who gets it. So market allocation of resources is a way of determining what is produced and who gets it. So first let's turn to the short-run market as rationer function. In a short period of time, the supply of a good or service may be fixed. Over time, a restaurant can be expanded, more fish can be brought in, and so forth. But on a particular evening or day, the supply may be fixed. And a market can be used to determine who gets it by letting the price vary to bring demand equal to the fixed level of supply. Now, at that point, at that price, at that equilibrium price, everyone who is willing and able to buy the good at that price will get it. And those who do not get the good are those who are not willing and able to pay the going price for the good. That's how it would work if the case is the seats in a restaurant on a given evening. The price would be set so that everyone who wanted to eat in that restaurant would get in, but would have to pay the price being charged. There are a number of arguments for using the market as a rationer of a good that is fixed in supply. First, it avoids the waste of having an excess supply that has to be thrown out. Unoccupied seats in the restaurant, fish that has to be thrown out. Second, the market method of rationing avoids the inconvenience to buyers of having a shortage. When you really wanted something, you could afford it, but you couldn't get it. Third, it can be argued that buyers who want it most will get it, although only if they can afford the price. There are also disadvantages of the market as rationer. The rich are favored over those who might have a greater need for the good if the price is allowed to rise to the level that will equate supply and demand. And in some cases, if we're talking about an essential good that people really feel they must have, using the market to ration it can produce a big transfer of wealth from the buyers to the sellers. Sellers of an essential good in short supply can jack the price way up, and people might have to part with a lot of their money to get it. Now, what are the alternatives to market as rationer of something fixed in supply? There is the common first come, first served. In a restaurant, usually market rationing is not used. Instead, if you want to get in, you have to show up early. That is more egalitarian. It gives everyone an equal chance, but it favors those with free time to stand in line. Another method is a lottery. That's viewed as fair, but unlikely to reward those who want the good the most. Then there are quotas, which is a form of planning. A quota system occurs when individuals or households are given the right to purchase a certain quantity of a good in short supply each day. During World War II, there was this form of rationing of goods in short supply, such as milk. You had to get a ration coupon, which you could get if you had small children who really needed the milk. Quotas put people in a more equal situation. They take account of need, but it requires an administrative apparatus. Now I'll turn to the other function of markets, the market as allocator. Markets can allocate resources in an economy over the long run when the supply of goods can be increased or decreased. Virtually all products over time eventually can be produced in greater or lesser quantity. If consumer preference for a good rises or falls, the market can reallocate resources. It can shift resources around in response through changes in the price. For example, suppose there's an increase in the demand for fish. Then people trying to buy it will bid up the price. They want more of it than is available, and the seller will be able to raise the price over time. The rising price will result in more of the good being produced over time, as the fish market will order more fish from the suppliers, and more fisher people will have jobs catching fish, or fisher farmers will be able to sell more fish that they farm. The higher price that arises in response to an increase in demand under market allocation leads to higher profits for the seller. And the higher profits are important here. They create an incentive for sellers to produce more of the good, and they provide sellers with the means to produce more of the good. The increased income flowing to the sellers enables them to buy more inputs. The final result is that more of the good is produced and sold in the new equilibrium situation. The lesson of this is that a market system constantly reallocates production. It shifts production around in response to changes in what consumers want, consumer preferences, and also, although I haven't given you an example, in response to the costs of producing various products. There is a famous metaphor that has been used for this process, that of the invisible hand. In a competitive market system, Adam Smith, the famous author of Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Adam Smith argued that in a competitive market system, a producer intends only his own gain, and he is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Adam Smith went on, by pursuing his own self-interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Now, there are arguments that a market allocation system is a good one. The arguments include that resources will be used to get the highest possible consumer satisfaction under market allocation, that a market system is an inexpensive and automatic method of matching production with what consumers want. And furthermore, that a market system guarantees a kind of individual freedom, the freedom to choose what to buy and what kind of work to do. On the other hand, critics of market allocation, and even some supporters of it, note that there are potential problems with the market as allocator. First, the problem of externalities. Externalities occur when the production or consumption of a good harms third parties. If one person buys and drives an automobile, it puts pollution into the air that affects third parties, that is, those who breathe the air. Many production processes generate externalities. They pollute the air and cause other problems for third parties. When there are externalities, market allocation is not efficient because it is not taking account of all the costs and benefits. Second is the problem of asymmetric information, which means some people have more than others. If a seller knows more about the product than the buyer can take advantage of the seller. Everyone knows this. If you go to a used car dealer, you have to worry that the used car dealer really knows what condition that used car is in, and you have little opportunity, little chance of really knowing. You can be ripped off. Third is the problem of public goods. These are goods that cannot be allocated efficiently by markets, such as national defense, fire protection. National defense will either be provided for everyone or not at all. It can't be sold. The Defense Department can't go door to door asking people to pay for the national defense. It won't work. As will be seen later in the course, information is a particular product that has the characteristic of a public good. Fourth, many markets are not and cannot be, will not be in practice competitive. There will be only one seller or only a few sellers. That leads to monopoly power, and when that occurs, consumers are ripped off. Another potential problem with markets is that the rich are favored under market allocation. It is the dollar votes of consumers that are supposed to drive the system, but the rich have a lot more dollar votes than others. Another problem is that market allocation creates economic insecurity. In a system of market allocation, people's livelihood, their income, depends on selling their labor time or their property, what they have to offer. And because that changes over time, sometimes rapidly, due to forces outside of their control, the value of what people can sell can go up, but it can go down very suddenly. And someone can learn a trade and find suddenly that it's no longer needed and they have no way to make a living. This creates economic insecurity, a problem for human health and welfare. Another problem, the last one I'll mention, is that it can be argued that a market system is a teacher. It is an educational system. A market system teaches certain kinds of behavior, that in particular it reinforces narrow, self-interested behavior. And as a result, it affects the way people will behave over time that may not always be favorable. Now, what is the alternative to market allocation? Economic planning is the alternative. What does that mean? Economic planning is a process aimed at determining or influencing the allocation of resources. That is, what is produced, how it's produced, and who gets what, so as to conform to a predetermined goal or program. Now, there are different forms of economic planning. One, called top-down central planning, guided the economy of such states as the Soviet Union, China in an earlier period, Cuba even today, in which a central authority decided the allocation of resources. A second form of planning, a much looser form, is called indicative planning. This occurs when the government issues an investment plan for private industry based on a study of how the economy is developing. However, that investment plan is not binding. Enterprises are free to decide whether or not to follow that approach. In France, in the 1950s and 60s, the government used indicative planning to try to improve the performance of what was basically a market economy. Third, the government can modify market allocation in various ways for certain goals, using taxes, subsidies, and the government's control over who gets credit and at what interest rate. Our government, the US government, uses such methods to attain certain goals, such as to make it cheaper for people to buy and live in their own home. Fourth, there is a more comprehensive form of planning in the way top-down central planning was in some countries, but it is one that has not existed in any large-scale country yet, but has been proposed, known as democratic participatory planning. In that system, representative public boards would allocate resources through negotiation among affected parties instead of based on prices and profits doing the job. Now, there are a number of arguments in favor of economic planning, that a planned allocation of resources, either completely planned or partially planned, can take account of externalities so as to discourage the production of goods that have a lot of negative external effects. In a planning system, it is possible to avoid the problem of asymmetric information since it's not based on the profit motive. Economic planning system can produce sufficient public goods. The problem of monopoly pricing can be avoided, again because it's not based on profits, the pursuit of profits. The distribution of goods among people in a planned system, it tends to be more equal than in market allocation. A planned system can create more security by stabilizing prices and incomes, assuring that they don't suddenly leap up or down due to market forces. And finally, a planning system tends to foster cooperative behavior rather than competitive behavior. However, there are also criticisms of the planning method of allocation. Critics argue that planning is not flexible enough, that it's resistant to change. They argue that its planned system is not good at responding to consumer wants, which change over time, that it's not effective at utilizing the information that is widespread within the population, that a planned system, because it's not based on the profit motive, would have incentive problems. People and companies would not be motivated to work effectively. Our critics argue that planning requires a costly administrative apparatus. And last, some critics argue that a planned economy would give too much power to the government, which plays a major role in planning, and that this would ultimately restrict individual freedom. Note that all of the arguments for and against market allocation and planning are highly contested. Thank you.